Welcome to the Anthro to UX podcast, where you will learn how to break into UX with an anthropology degree. Through conversations with leading anthropologists working in user experience, you will learn firsthand how others made the transition, what they learned along the way, and what they would do differently. We will be discussing what it means to do UX research from a practical perspective and what you need to do to prepare a resume and portfolio. I'm your host, Matt Artz, a business anthropologist specializing in design anthropology and working at the intersection of product management, user experience, and business strategy. Let's get started. Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Matt Artz of Anthro to UX. I'm here today with Racine Brown. Racine is about to start a new role as a senior UX researcher at AnswerLab. Previous to this new role was a manager of user experience research and business analysis at Radiant Digital, and in the past served a tour in the United States Marine Corps as a platoon leader and staff officer. So Racine, thanks for joining me today. Would you mind by telling everybody how you got interested in anthropology?
That'd be just fine. First of all, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. I got interested in anthropology at a fairly early age, in some sense even before I knew what it was, and in a really different vein than I'm in now. I had that 1960s Time Life book with about human evolution, with the different artist renderings of different hominins and the linear progression from the monkey to the man, and it's just a fascinating subject. So I went into my undergrad at Wake Forest toying with the idea of majoring anthropology to be a paleoanthropologist and study Neanderthals, which I found out is Neanderthal, not Neanderthal. I did become an anthropology major, but got more interested in cultural anthropology as I actually got into the major courses. And then I, managed to graduate from Wake Forest, but didn't knock it out of the park perfectly, and also didn't quite know what I wanted to do. Had a sort of inner compulsion to serve. So I did that tour in the Marine Corps. As I was nearing the end of those 4 years and deciding, do I want to stay in and make it a career or do something else, anthropology kind of kept calling to me again. So I got out with the idea of eventually getting a PhD and being a professor of anthropology. Decided to do a terminal master's degree at the University of South Carolina. When I started, that was the terminal degree in that department, and it was a very solid 4 fields approach program. And I started out in cultural anthropology, eventually ended up concentrating in biocultural medical anthropology, and continued that work, concentrating on anthropometric nutritional status, which is height, weight, skin folds, measuring the body to assess nutritional status as opposed to doing assays with chemicals and things like that, and food security. So that was what my work in my PhD program in the University of South Florida really focused on. So that's how my passion for anthropology really just stems from being interested in people and what they do and the why of what they do, how your mind and personality are developed, and it's not just biodetermined, and it's not culture in the ether, but some combination of those thereof, and just being a sort of a bookish kid, looking at the pictures of the linear progression. So that's my anthro passion in a nutshell.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing. And I think many of us, will obviously share your story in the sense that we've been inspired at a young age and sort of ended up following that path, even if it sometimes zigzagged a bit. In your case, you did the tour in the Marine Corps. And so, I'd be curious to know, how did that influence the way you thought about going back to get an anthropology degree, or how you might use an anthropology degree? Did that play any role?
I would think a little bit. There were times, full disclosure, I missed going to Iraq by about 6 months, and I knew plenty of Marines that went. have mixed feelings about that. But some of the training I did, a lot of it was in cold, bitter cold weather. A lot of it was hot, sticky weather. So chairs and air conditioning, took on a new flair for me during those 4 years. I like being out in nature and fresh air, but I came to a new appreciation. Another thing, though, is that the way the Marine Corps operates tends to be more expeditionary than some of the other services. And what that means is for deployments, doing more with less. And if you look at the history of the service, people can critique, say what was good, what was bad. But the Marine Corps has an approach historically of interacting with local populations that's more developed than the other services, with the possible exception, of course, of special forces. But the idea that you have to understand whoever your enemy is, but also the local population in which they operate to prosecute a counterinsurgency, for instance. And then, of course, General Petraeus later picked up on a lot of this work and wrote a book about it. But I realized that we were trained for these things in the Marine Corps, but at the same time, I was usually the only person I'd ever heard of that heard of anthropology. A lot of people with engineering degrees in the officer corps, some people with more sort of practical application degrees like safety, things like that. But I just got to thinking, hey, an anthropological perspective might be useful to thinking about foreign policy. Just think about how this country interacts with people in other cultures, or interacting with cultures in this country. So I think the influence that has had is, really being humble, wanting to dig in and understand, other cultures for its own sake, but also providing some practical benefit, to people who in cultures that don't have as much power, and somehow being able to translate in real terms to those in power, to those insulated by being in a more powerful culture. Hey, there's not only one way to do things. There's not only one way to live. And, even putting aside all of, the multisyllabic social theory and things, that have their own use in learning, but just being able to tell people, there are different ways of living, and we could all, this is a truism and a broad statement, but I think generally people around the world can use more humility in learning about each other, and getting to know the other rather than simply preparing for war. On the other hand, I think I'm more sympathetic to the national security establishment than many anthropologists, having been a cog in it for 4 years, and realizing that the people in the DoD, be they in uniform or civilians, National Security Council, they're not, Skeletor-esque supervillains trying to take over the world. They are operating within cultural constructs themselves. And to not assume, these people, they don't know Bordeaux, and, the Leatherman, they can't be as smart as me. No, they have just been trained in different paradigms from that 30,000-foot view. And really, I think for people to learn about each other, you have to combine that 30,000-foot, meta view of geopolitics, for instance, with how people live on the ground, as the cliche goes.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an interesting experience you have there. And when you decided to come out and focus on medical, did the military experience also influence that?
I'm not so sure if it was. I won't naysay that it did. I won't foreclose that possibility. Absolutely. I think in some sense, what influenced my focus on medical was the medical anthropology classes I took at Wake Forest as an undergrad, just really showed me that health isn't a simpler linear equation, that sickness isn't just a matter of virology, although that is a major factor, of course, and that people eating poorly and not exercising isn't just a matter of ill discipline and poor habits, but there are structural factors there as well. And then, so I think there was that perspective. And then, I took medical anthropology again at a mixed undergrad split. Toomey was the professor's name, and that focused a lot on the different systems of healing, naturalistic, personalistic, biomedical, etc. And then I took Tom Leatherman's biocultural anthropology class. I think it was either required or I needed some credits, and I realized there's a lot of overlap between biocultural perspective and medical anthropology, even though, of course, there's critical medical anthropology, which is less about what happens in the body and more about critical, critiques of systems. But, it's all important. And then it talked a lot, Leatherman's class talked a lot about the intersection of diet, political economic factors such as where people could live, what healthcare they could access, what they could feasibly do for a living. For example, people in the Yucatan Peninsula being cut off from traditional agricultural lifeways or having that diminished because they wanted money from tourism or construction in Cancun or the Mayan Riviera, as it's now called. That those, you might have a select local people in those tourist spaces being able to afford better food, also eating a lot more sugar, and then others living in more marginal areas geographically and not having access to good food and not having access even to all the sort of produce they might have had back in their home village. So those intersections really fascinated me, and I thought, maybe this is a space where I could weigh in and explore, okay, not only what are the micro and medium level socio-political, ecological factors that influence what people can eat and how they can move around in their health, but, is there something I could do to improve the situation? So I think that, those are the factors that really influence me to do biocultural medical anthropology in my academic work.
So you commented there about, what could you influence, which is interesting because there are many anthropologists who are maybe less interested in influencing and maybe more interested in documenting. So what gave you that sort of interventionist mindset?
I don't know, probably watching He-Man too much as a child, But I mean, of course, through graduate school, I've understood the critique of interventionism and realized that, that unintended consequences can be negative and are a real possibility. I think in some ways, and maybe it circles back to your question about military influence, I have a tension between the critique and documenting approach in anthropology and that humility that, just because you're Western educated and, come from a socio-cultural elite on a global scale, that you're not going to just go in and kind of save the day. You need to understand the local situation from people's perspectives. But, in the Marine Corps, they said always have a bias for action. And in those, combat situations or rescue situations, if you're unsure what to do, chances are doing nothing is the worst thing you can do in that kind of situation. And others, in terms of an intervention in a more systemic, slower rolling problem, that approach might not be as effective. But in the spaces where the Marine Corps operates and excels, bias for action is very useful. And so I think, and even as silly as it sounds, even playing sports in high school, typically you're supposed to do something, even if you're down, if you're in an unfamiliar situation. So I think there's some element of enculturation of do something. And I think, the academic critique of heroic interventionism is valid, but at the same time, there's a critique of academe in terms of analysis paralysis, and that is also valid. There is a place for basic science. Really helpful discoveries can come when there isn't a pressure to discover or do this specific thing, but a broader mandate. But at the same time, there is a real ethical quandary about documenting food insecurity, serious detriments to nutritional health, syndemics of infectious disease. For instance, my PhD advisor, David Himmelgreen, his work dealt with the syndemic of HIV in Lesotho in South Africa, that your outcome of being infected by HIV was culturally mediated, but the sequelae of the disease, once one was infected, was profoundly affected by diet and other health, social determinants of health factors. And then if you have that knowledge, is it enough to publish it in densely written journals that only other academics in your specific subfield, not discipline, subfield, are going to read? So I think that question has propelled me to at least want to make a difference in a scientifically informed way.
And so how much did that play into your decision to focus on UX, which, coming from where you came from in your PhD program is a little bit of a leap?
Sure. Well, it does. It absolutely does. I won't say that, that proactive approach brought me directly from a PhD to UX. It didn't. I worked for the VA, first as a project manager and then a postdoctoral fellow in a research center, through that same desire to positively impact people's health, especially people who've served our country. So in a very proximate sense, my journey into UX was possible because my fellowship ended and my grant didn't get funded. However, once I had the opportunity to learn more about UX, it was an almost comic eureka moment, because I determined that it was, here is a way to make impact in real time. I think it's very hard for a career UX researcher to profoundly impact social theory or become a preeminent academic, but one can make a positive impact for users or potential users of a technology in a much shorter time. For instance, even in clinical research, if findings of a study are validated and get to the level of theory, it takes an average of 15 to 17 years for findings to be and analyses to appear in print in a peer-reviewed journal to making their way into clinical practice. The good thing about UX research, granted, it's usually defined as a business problem, though not always, but usually defined more as a business problem than a broader societal problem. And someone else might be calling the tune on what you study, as opposed to academia where people choose their own topic to study. But a UX researcher can make an impact for the better in a very short, in real time, compared to some other endeavors.
Yeah, and potentially at a very large scale.
Yes.
Depending on where you work. So you haven't been in UX, too many years now. And so though you have a lot of research experience, transferring into UX is always, it's always a little bit of a battle. So what kind of hurdles did you encounter in your journey?
I think the main hurdles were being perceived as you're ready to go from the gate, so to speak. Because as many how to break into UX research articles say, I recapitulate all my dissertation and VA research in the most UX terms possible. But I think interviewers, in those early years knew that, okay, this guy has a PhD, has research experience, but it is not about, software applications, much less any other technology. It's looking about food and nutrition, doing consulting work for, beneficent nonprofits, but not in the realm of technology. So, just getting that initial, I had to take courses and do a lot of informational interviews to learn the lingo, so to speak, and to say card sorting instead of pile sorting, and talk about concepts that are important in UX, but not so important in academe. But then I think the main facilitator in jumping those hurdles, so to speak, was doing small startup projects where I actually did do, UX research. It wasn't perfectly executed. I didn't even always get to do all that I wanted to do in terms of solving business problems, but at least I had practical things of, okay, here's an app we were designing and developing. I, did a small pilot project, netnography, for instance, in the target market. Here's what I found, and here's what I recommended. It worked out well. And so I think I started to get more traction once I sort of stumbled into those initial startup roles. But just convincing because I got some interviews with hiring managers, but just convincing hiring managers that I was ready to do UX research per se and wasn't an anthropologist who wouldn't know where to begin on doing tech-related research.
So I certainly agree with you and back up that having like sort of those portfolio projects is really helpful. But even sometimes before you get to talk about those projects, you do need a resume, and that does need to sort of make its way through to even get to, past the recruiter and to a hiring manager. And so since this is still a little fresh for you, and since you've now moved on to the second job, I'd like to maybe just stay in this space for a bit. I'm curious to know, what did you do to iterate on your early resume, and has that changed this second time around?
Well, so with Radiant, of course, I have, several software-related projects to talk about. So I've kind of phased, talking about my dissertation project as a service design and some of that less tech-oriented consulting work out, and put more stuff from Radiant and the startup, software projects in. I think another thing, and of course, I've learned, terms and become more comfortable with them in doing work in a larger company. And then, I've had some help from friends just reformatting the resume to be, more appealing and amenable in a UX or UX research shop. And another thing I think that has helped is doing some letting go. What I mean by that is that there was a period of about 5 years where I had a 2-page resume, and I still, tried to keep it very tight because, it's not an academic CV. More pages does not give you credit. But I just had, I treated my dissertation as a job, because even though I didn't get paid salary and benefits, it is real work. And I think that is a potential sea change, because with an academe, it was just school. A lot of hiring managers in industry, consider it, this is just your schooling. The classes are schooling. Putting together a grant proposal, doing a dissertation project, all of that is, in my view, and I'm not alone, that's real work. But I've gotten to a point where I've done enough projects that are specific to UX research that it's better to focus. I have all this other stuff in my LinkedIn profile. But, my VA experience, being in the Marine Corps, doing a dissertation, very profoundly informs who I am and how I approach things. But I've learned it doesn't need to be the opening gamut, or it doesn't have to be part of the opening gamut of how I present myself to recruiters and hiring managers, because at the end of the day, they want to know what UX projects I've worked on. So those are some of the things I've changed my resume, tightened it up even further, and then let go of, my brother is sort of a high-power businessman, has helped me a lot along the way in terms of being more succinct, tailoring resumes, but it's tailoring resumes just generally to business. So, full margins, dense, 10-point font text, and then, but there are other formats, for UX research that are just less dense and easier on the eye. And you find out in resumes that not only do you have to tailor the content to what job you're applying for, in some cases, you really want to tailor the format. Learn about the company, talk to people working in that company or in that space. And, if the traditional business dense text format isn't what they're looking for, change to what they are looking for.
Yeah, no, it's good feedback. And I guess related to that is, the concept of a portfolio. And of course, researchers disagree if you should have a portfolio or not, and companies either may or may not ask you for one. Did you produce one?
I did produce one. I did not. It wasn't required when I applied for AnswerLab. I opted to give them a redacted report because it was an example of real work. And it was already in a fairly tight format. To be honest, I haven't completely updated my portfolio since I started at Radiant. And I don't know if Radiant even asked me for one. There does seem to be at least two camps of like, okay, is their portfolio important? It's something that's bedeviled me as a researcher because I just don't have, I'd certainly try and make it visually appealing, but I just don't have the heavy visuals that a career designer would have. And I think as a researcher, you want, depending on the audience, you want to make your reports visual and accessible in the sense of cognitively or intellectually accessible. That's something so distinct from what CAG standards and accessibility for disability. Though that's people, I think, are starting to wake up that that's important too. But I'm still in process of trying to balance, make it appealing and engaging, but with enough presentation of findings and data to let hiring managers know that, yes, I am a researcher and I can present, serious work if need be. And I think in some ways it's a conundrum for researchers presenting a portfolio, but it's also a useful exercise in being succinct and engaging with stakeholders and other audience who are not researchers or certainly not academics. One thing I'd say I'm still in the process of learning, but I've grown better at over the years, is presenting that high-level view of, what are the takeaways, what's important, and then having a lot more information in my back pocket if someone gets curious and wants to do a deep dive, but not front-end loading all of that information and just overwhelming the audience.
Yeah. And so what taught you that along the way? Just the experience of presenting to, business stakeholders?
The experience of presenting to business stakeholders. That businessman brother said, you must be nuts. Why are you talking about bioculturalism and political ecology and all of this? Cut this, be more succinct. And even at Radiant, I've had a few times where I thought I was being succinct and been told, this is just dense bullet points in a table. You need to tighten this up. And just realizing that, and I think this is where a key learning has occurred. And even from undergrad at Wake Forest, they had high standards in writing an essay and providing those supporting details explicitly. And if you're writing an essay, that's important. If you're presenting to executives, business leads, those need to be accessible at request. But what people really want is the bottom line. What is the takeaway? You need to be able to support it, but you don't put the kitchen sink worth of all of your supporting details in academia. In many settings, that's expected, and even in other types of deliverables like a conference presentation that need to be more succinct than a simple essay, the content is still much more dense than a business presentation. And so, just having to learn, don't say the thing and here's my support. Just say the thing and be open to a conversation, be open to talking about and elaborating further as, your audience needs.
Because especially the, different audiences need different amounts of information.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like at Radiant you learned, quite a bit about conducting, research in the context of the business setting and the sort of constraints of business, the business environment. So aside from being concise, presenting clearly, any other major takeaways from this?
You better be adaptable. Sometimes, and you have to be quick. Radiant works. We do different projects for different clients, but there's one major client in a legacy industry, and we work with their at Radiant. We worked with their network technology group, and they did the Safe Agile approach, which please don't quiz me on what SAFE means, but it is the acronym, but it is a way of adapting the Agile framework to large enterprises, which is no small feat. And so what that means is you have Agile teams working as teams of teams on a platform. And so we did things in 2-week sprints that were strung together in what's called a program increment over roughly a quarter, a business, quarter. And, you would have to do some sort of research activity within 2 weeks. So for instance, whatever's on your JIRA ticket, you have to do it within 2 weeks or your team looks bad. So you have to recruit, get your list of potential participants quickly. You have to recruit quickly. You might have a day or so for data analysis. So the pressure to prioritize and spend less time is much greater than in academe or even in program evaluation. So it's a matter of doing things faster, of living with a less comprehensive and in some cases less thorough end product than you can do in other endeavors. But my mantra is always do the absolute best you can and most thorough in the time allotted. And the time for that activity is a matter of days or weeks and not months. So, the pace, and then just learning to listen to stakeholders and being the expert, but at the same time being able to dial back on being the expert. For instance, there was one project I did where I talked to end users about a current application that was going to be onboarded to the platform, and they were enthusiastic. They gave me a lot of insights. I presented it at in a culminating session to the business lead and the IT lead, and they just weren't hearing it. They were very defensive. They're saying, we already know about all this. We have a ticketing system, and it was tense enough that our product owner had to call a separate meeting. And, I explained the insights further, but before I did that, I just listened to what they had to say. And I listened to the current processes, but, because I had to learn sometimes, your IT and business, we invite them to earlier sessions in design, because we used a design thinking approach to do empathy sessions, which is your contextual inquiry or other types of user interviews, but also do a define session, an ideate session, which is really turns into a blend, at least in this case, between doing research and doing a workshop. And you invite IT and business to all those. They typically show up at the end. And if they haven't been hearing what the end users said, and so, I listened to them, and then I made the case that, hey, I'm not here to replace you or to antagonize you. This is complementary to the processes that you are using to collect feedback. And, the design development still moved along pretty slowly, but it was that you have to take a step back and be flexible in the approach and building rapport and even recruiting participants in just a different way. Because you can do customer-facing research or with UX, you can give incentives. You can recruit a wide pool. In some sense, we had a captive audience because it was enterprise software. But if people, we didn't have incentives to give people. So recruiting was just a different challenge. And so I realized that any situation within business, nonprofits, academia is going to be different. And you have to be very flexible and attuned to adapting to a new situation.
What did you think of the process of, sharing your insights and getting buy-in and, really in many ways the need to constantly stay in front of people, remind them of what you're finding, kind of convince them even to, certainly to a degree?
I mean, it was frustrating, but I think I kept perspective because even when I was doing my dissertation research, I had a learning curve. I kind of had to figure out how to show respect for people's time in ways that I hadn't anticipated to convince them to participate. And then, I did a second round of data collection because that's what the research plan called for. And some people were amenable and did the second round. Some people said, even though I thought I'd explained in my own head, I am coming back around. Excuse me. They said, I already talked to you. Why are you bothering me again? And, I had people that would agree to do it at a certain time and they wouldn't show up, or, they'd show up 30 minutes later. So I started sliming in 10, 15 minutes late. And then, I'd have those like a couple of occasions where I did that and someone was angry because I wasn't on time. So, luckily I had experience with having friction in recruitment and having people actually participate. But I just got to, realize another thing about perspective is that, because it was enterprise software and the end users, weren't going to make extra money, or, like they could benefit if we improved the software, but you're asking people to take time out from their day job because, they're not going to want to come in on the weekend and not get paid extra to, if these are salaried people, they're not getting paid overtime to participate. And then sometimes you had things like union rules or other parameters that we didn't anticipate as to when people could participate in research, if they could. And so, it goes back to humility, taking a few deep breaths when you're frustrated, and just talking to stakeholders or whoever we need to figure out, okay, how can we make this happen?
And at Radiant, were you on a team of UX researchers, or were you the first hire in that role?
Yes, just all around. Because I think they had a UX researcher that had left the company a little while before. So at the time I was hired, I was the only UX researcher, dedicated UX researcher who did it full time. We had some designers that knew something about research, and occasionally they would take on projects, the research phase as well as the design phase, but I was the only full-time UX researcher. Eventually, they put me administratively in charge of a couple of business analysts. And so that was interesting, learning about a matrix organization in terms of being in charge of people's performance and their career development in some sense, but them definitely reporting to someone else when it came to project work. So that was interesting. And then, so I'd say for about a little over a year, I was the only full-time UX researcher. And then we did a very rapid hiring of a team. I think at its biggest, it was about 9 researchers. So we did a rapid hiring, and it was still matrix because, I was administratively in charge, did the training, performance evaluations, things like that. But at the same time, and we were all, unlike with the two business analysts, we were all on the same project, like the same, team for that big legacy industry client. But we did different projects within that project. And, when they were doing work research on the initiatives, they would report to the UX architect for that initiative for for instance, there was a time when the UX architect called me and some of the new researchers working on his initiative into a meeting and said, we need user flows. I hadn't really been producing user flows very much. It had been more of a split between designers getting documentation and I presenting journey maps and empathy maps about the experience. But, he told them, we need user flows because the designers need to see the architecture, how it goes. And so they produced user flows. But then other initiatives didn't ask for that. And then likewise, our product owner and Scrum Master would ask everyone, in a more flat organizational approach, what are you working on? What are your blockers? And at the same time, I was training the team, managing and leading them. I was also doing frontline research myself on some other projects within that same team.
So it's interesting because, you sort of start as a team of one. You eventually hire and you're leading, which is a nice opportunity. But I'm more so focused on the first part of that because as a team of one, you really, you need to teach yourself some things like you mentioned, journey maps, user flows, right? So you first need to make sure you sort of understand these things, be able to produce them. Then you need to train others in them, and you need to really stay abreast of the sort of changes of the discipline. So what were you doing, to stay on top of this all?
A lot of combing on LinkedIn. I have a lot of UX researchers in my network and on my feed. Going to Nielsen Norman Group, for some of the resources they have. And then another thing, just flat out looking at templates. I really like the Miro template for journey maps. There are other, it is not the one approach. There are other approaches. Miro takes a little bit of a learning curve, learning how to use it. One could do a usability study on that, but it's visually appealing. It's relatively clean and not too dense. So, I knew, from other coursework what a journey map was, but, refresh myself with online resources that are mostly text describing with some pictures, and then just played around with the Miro template. Likewise, our PO knew a little bit about UX research artifacts because she, did, I think it was a remote course on UX design from the D School at Stanford, if I remember correctly. And she just shared out templates. And I, looked and critiqued, okay, what are the benefits of this? What is it missing? And thought, is this what our audience can use? And it turns out, our empathy map template we used probably isn't the prettiest one out there, but it's simple and it's a good way to present those core ideas about what people are thinking, feeling, doing, and saying. And I mean, for me, like the thinking and feeling, to some extent saying, was a bit of a judgment call. But, I learned by looking at those templates, kind of triangulating that, what I've read and learned in coursework over the years. And then, how do people respond? I do take feedback, when people, do they engage with my artifacts or do they just sit there? Do they, does anyone ever point out any major holes? Fortunately, it's been minor holes. But it's, what questions do people ask? And that generally informs subsequent iterations, if you will, of those empathy maps, journey maps. even user flows of like, okay, what are people looking like? When you have the classic, template of a journey app, what are people really looking for? What's important? And my perspective, I'm sure some other worthy, more experienced person could debate me and know more about this, but my perspective is, at least in, your iteration here and now, it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to, find the core things that your audience needs to know and to engage with visually, and do that and iterate from there, based on critiques or based on questions.
The visual tools are meant to facilitate a conversation.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Similar to that, obviously, if you're building a team, there's some things to learn about that process. So for anybody out there who might be in a similar position where team of one, but they're starting to grow, what were your key takeaways from that experience?
Sometimes you got to be fast and adaptable too. The building of the team was part of an initiative, initiatives coming out from that major client, and they wanted us to build, a team in a certain way. And, I learned sometimes you want to do things a certain way, but when you're getting a lot of pressure to step on the gas, you have to balance, okay, the standard approach to hiring to, okay, what do we do? What can we do in the time allotted? And I had to make judgment calls. So in some ways, our hiring process, we hired mid-level researchers and took on some interns. So I had to, some of the researchers were interns. So I had to make up an internship program, from not completely from scratch. We had a template in terms of a design internship, but how do I adapt that to get adequate training for, some people might have taken coursework in UX research. I looked for as many anthropologists as I could, and other social scientists. So they had talent for research, but how do you help them adapt to a tech environment? And so, I had to balance that pressure to, get people in the door with, okay, how are we going to make sure if they're not perfect on paper, at least they have enough potential, that it's as fair as can be and that they can grow into the space. And, one thing I insisted on, even though I got some blowback for it, is a research challenge. Now, this is a very controversial topic, I think. And if your research challenge takes, 40 hours, you're wrong. And if you're trying to get your candidates to solve your business problems, you're wrong. What we did at Radiant was we took a local, municipal service challenge that had nothing to do with our work, asked people to spend about 2 hours on it. And I live with that because on the one hand, we did not pay them to do this challenge, but you're getting a real demonstration of, work competence and professionalism. And so it balances out, from those who might know their stuff and be great, have great potential, but are not perfect job interviewers, or those who might not be as strong, but can talk the perfect game, learn all of the jargon and say all the right words and talk smoothly. And I had a candidate or two over the, those months that did well in the interview, but then didn't do so well in the research challenge. So it's a sort of, in some ways, a more fair way of, assessing people's potential through their actions. And then, I learned from that also that if one has more time for hiring, be more deliberate, compare more candidates. I don't think there is a need for the sort of cumbersome process that many companies have. But there is a space for, more deliberation, both on, people's responses in interviews, how they do on a hopefully, concise work example, to really, think about not only just how good a person is at something, but to make, an assessment on their potential fit based on at least a few factors and not just a hip shot judgment of, did I like this person in the interview?
Yeah, well, very good feedback there and input for anybody who's sort of a team of one looking to grow. So it sounds like you had a lot of great experience at Radiant Digital, and that sounds like it really helped kind of propel you forward now into AnswerLab. And so good luck at AnswerLab.
Thank you.
I've talked to a few people from AnswerLab, either on this podcast or just sort of offline. It sounds like a great place. So I wish you luck, and sounds like it would be a nice opportunity. If people wanted to get in touch with you to learn a little bit more, where should they find you?
If you Google, search Racine Marcus Brown on LinkedIn, I think there's one or two Racine Browns. I think I'm the only Racine Marcus Brown on LinkedIn. Also, I respond pretty well to email. It's all under caps, Racine_Brown@yahoo.com. Those are probably the two best ways to reach me.
Well, Racine, thanks for coming on. Appreciate taking the time.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all for listening to the Anthro to UX podcast. To learn everything you need to break into UX, visit anthro2ux.com. There you will find all the podcast episodes and career coaching resources. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.